Today, I'd like to begin by reviewing what we did yesterday, because I think in Masechet Yevamot, it's good to go over and over. We had a Tosfos here on the bottom of Daf Beis Amud Aleph, and I'd like to summarize the main points of that Tosfos. Tosfos is dealing with the case of Achos Ishto, which, if you recall, is the one single category of the 15 arayos, which is temporary, so to speak. In other words, there's a matir, and that erva relationship could be removed in event that his wife dies, and then he's allowed to marry his wife's sister. Now, Tosfos is bothered why Nida doesn't appear on this list. So what happens if Shimon dies and he leaves his wife for Yibum for Ruvain, but she's a Nida at that time? So Tosfos says, don't give me an answer that, well, it's a temporary kind of an erva relationship, because the Nida could be Mitaheres as Atzma, she'll go to Mikvah, because we see already the precedent of Achos Ishto, his wife's sister, that's also a temporary erva, and it could be removed, and nevertheless, it has the full weight of an erva. It's listed in the 15, and there's no yibum, and it patches up the tzara. So therefore, we're back to square one. What about Nida? Why isn't that mentioned here? And Tosfos says in his first answer that there's a fundamental difference between Achos Isha and Nida. In Achos Isha, there's a reason why there's an Iser Erva specifically on this Yavam, on this Ruvain, either because this Erva is related to Ruvain, or because this erva is related to the wife of Reuven. In other words, through marriage, it became a relationship. But one way or the other, the nature of this Easter and the fundamental generation of this Easter, it's generated as an erva specifically on the Yavam. Not so in the case of Nida. Nida is an erva for every single person. And therefore, it's not a full-fledged erva in the sense that we have halach that an erva does not fall for yibum. That's not true in the case of Nida. Why? Because Nida is not an erva. An erva means that there's something specific about the relationship between this woman and this man that generated the Iser erva. That's not true in the case of Nida. That was point number one. Now, Tosfos goes ahead and he proves that Nida is included in the mitzvah of Yibum, because Rabbi Yochanan says that if a man accidentally has a relationship with his wife who's a Nida, then he has to bring a chatas. But if he accidentally has a relationship with his sister-in-law, meaning in a situation of Yibum, and she happens to be a Nida at that time, he's potter. And why is he potter? The Gemara explains here in Yevamot on Daf Ayin Beis, he's potter because of ka'avid mitzvah. He's doing a mitzvah. So you see that the Gemara considers it as if a yavam who implements yibum has a relationship with his yavama, and she's a nida, he still fulfills the mitzvah of yibum. And that's why, even though she's a nida, he doesn't have to bring a karmat chatas. Okay. Then Tosfos says, I can come up with a different distinction between Achos Isha and Nida. And he says that Achos Isha, once she became P'tura B'Shah Achas, then we activate the principle called Joachel Darchi Nom. What does that mean? Let's say that at the moment that Shimon died and he left Leah for Yibum to fall in front of Reuven, Reuven was married to Rachel. Later on, Rachel died. We're not going to say, well, now Leah falls for Yibum to Reuven because it's no longer an erev of Achos Ishto. No. Since Shah Achas, for one moment, at the time of the death of Shimon, when Leah fell for Yibum, there was no Yibum, because at that moment, Reuven was married to Rachel, that's his wife, and that means that the Yevamah is Leah's his wife's sister. Therefore, we're going to apply the principle of Dracheh Darchino, which means that once we gave her the green light, the license to get married, because we said at that moment there was no Yibum, we're not going to take away that license. Because you could imagine, let's say in the interim, she gets married. And now we're going to say, well, Reuven's wife, Leah, Rachel, passed away. Now you, Leah, you have to get out of this marriage to Yankel Beryl because now you fall to Yibum to Reuven. That's not Dracheh Darchino. However, Tosfos says in the case of Nida, there's no issue of Dracheh Darchino. If we say to the Yevama, look, right now the situation is frozen, meaning you cannot have an intimate relationship with the Yavam, he cannot materialize or realize the mitzvah of Yibum because you're in Nida. But wait a while, and there will be Yibum. Why? Because you'll go to mikvah, and now you can implement the Yibum. So that the situation now, in the case of a Nida, is that it's hovering, it's waiting for the right moment. But it's not that she is excluded from the Zikas Yibum and she can get married. We never gave her a green light to marry someone else. We just told her, wait until this process of Tara will pass by. Now, Tosfos, as we'll soon see, is going to compare the situation of a Nida to the situation of a Yavam who's out in Yehupitz. And it'll take a while till he comes in, but there still isn't a few Yibum. In the middle of this Tosfos, he makes reference to another sugya on Daf Pei Zayin Amud Beis. Now, what is this sugya all about? What happens in the following scenario? There's Shimon. Shimon is married to Leah, the sister of Reuven, his brother's wife, Rachel. And there's a third brother. In addition to Reuven and Shimon, there's Levi. At the time that Shimon dies, and Reuven is married to Leah's sister Rachel, there's no Nefilu L'Yibum vis-a-vis Reuven, but there is a Nefilu L'Yibum vis-a-vis Levi. Now what happens if before Levi, does what he has to do, and he's miyabim, in the meantime, in the interim, Rachel dies. And now the question is, does Leah fall for Yibum to Reuven? And l'chora mimanavshach, the answer should be yes. Why? She's not an Erev to Reuven because Rachel died. Eli will tell me that the moment that Shimon died, Leah was frozen, so to speak, waiting, as it were, for Rachel, maybe she'll die. That's not true, because since there was a third brother who's not related to Leah, therefore she's already suspended, so to speak. She's already caught in the net of Yibum, of Zikas Yibum. And now that Reuven lost his wife Rachel, he should be able to be miyabim Leah, because what are you going to tell me? It's not Dracheh Darchino. Why is it not Dracheh Darchino? We never gave license to Leah to get married to anyone else because Levi's in the picture. And now that Rachel died, why don't we go back to the square one, so to speak, and we should say that now Leah falls for Yibum to Reuven.
And that's because Levi
consummated. Right? So since he hasn't consummated, now Reuven could be miyabim. And the Gemara says no. Even if we don't have to undermine the heter, the license that we gave her to Leah to get married, because she was not excluded from this house, meaning from the family of her husband, her late husband, Shimon, because she has a brother-in-law by the name of Levi. He could go on. Nevertheless, she cannot fall for Yibum. She cannot have a marriage relationship with Reuven, even though Reuven's wife, Rachel, died. Why? So the Gemara, and this is very important for us because it's going to come up over and over again, The Gemara Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis formulates the following principle. You should really, if you have your own Gemara, underline this, because again, highlight this. It's going to come up over and over again. Kol Yevamot she'ein ani kori ba b'shas nefila Yevama yavo eleha is harei hi ke'eshes ach sheyesh la banim v'asura. So Tosfos says that if at the moment of nefila, meaning at the moment of the death of Shimon, there's no yibum, then she becomes an eshes ach. Right? We have the erva of a sister-in-law. And that erva remains because at the time of the nefila yibum, there was nothing to remove that Isser eshes ach. And why? Because she had from either she or some other woman had from Shimon a child. So even if that child dies, there will be no yibum because there was no nefila yibum to be matter the Isser of eshes ach. And therefore, there will never be yibum, even after her son dies. And the same thing is going to apply in our case, of course, when Reuven's wife Rachel died subsequent to the nefila yibum. That means after Shimon died. And he says, the ein ze darkei noam im yesh la lizdakek lo zeh sheniftra himenu. Those are the key words. And Tosfos is saying that since at the time Shimon died, she was now an erva to Reuven. What does that mean, an erva to Reuven? She was an erva to Reuven because Reuven's wife, Rachel, is her sister. And that's called achos ishto. But in addition to that, she's eshes ach. She's a sister-in-law because she was married to Reuven's brother, Shimon. What are you going to tell me there's a mitzvah of yibum? But here there's no mitzvah of yibum. And since there was no mitzvah of yibum, at the moment that she fell for yibum, that means Shimon's death, because Reuven was married to Rachel, therefore, even later when Rachel dies, she will not create, or the halacha will not recognize a zikas yibum between Leah and Reuven. Because if there was no zikas yibum between Leah and Reuven at the time of Shimon's death, you don't create a zikas yibum later on. There's no zikas yibum later on. It's got to be a zikas yibum between her and him at the time of the death of the Yavam, at the time of the death of Shimon. And Tosfos says, that's our expanded definition of Rachel darkei noam. In light of the Gemara Daf Chav Zayin, Tosfos says that we can reinterpret Rachel darkei noam such that even if there's a third brother named Levi, so as we said before, right now, her situation, Leah, at the time of the death of her husband Shimon, is that she's trapped in the net, as we call it, the zika of yibum. It doesn't matter why, because she has no zikas yibum to Reuven. And Rachel darkei noam tells me that if there was no zikas yibum to Reuven, then now she becomes an erva of eshes ach. Avol nida darkei noam hi. Why? That even if it was a normal, regular, classic marriage relationship, he would still have to wait until Atara, until he can have an intimate relationship. Now Tosfos mentions Katan, and he invokes the sugi at the end of Masechet Yevamot. What happens in a case where a woman who's a katana falls for yibum to a boy who's a katan? And that sounds pretty, at the face of it sounds pretty bizarre, but it's not bizarre at all. Why? Because her father married her off, and the Torah says that a father can marry off his daughter as a katana. Now her husband dies, she falls for yibum to her husband's brother, but it happens to be that he's right now a katan. So what's the halach in such a case? So the Gemara says that in such a case, let me just get the place here. Yavam Katan Shebal Yavama Ketana Yigdalu Zev Zev. They will grow older together until they actually consummate the mitzvah of Yibum. So the Gemara asks the following question: wait a second. How can you say such a thing? There was no din of Yibum at the time that, let's call him, Shimon died. Why? Because Shimon's wife fell to Yibum until Levi. Levi at this point is a katan. A katan is not included in the parsha of Yibum because we assume he cannot be making shamed li'achiv hameis. So if there was no nefil Yibum at the time of the death of Shimon the Yavam, then we should apply the principle that we applied before. Also says no. There too, it's just a matter of waiting. There should be an nefil yibum to this young boy. There's no reason why there shouldn't be. Ella, what he's not included in the mitzvah yibum, we'll wait until he becomes bar mitzvah, and then he's included in the mitzvah yibum. And that case is similar to the case of Nida.
Actually make it happen, whereas with with
and the visa of the
Nida, there is an action that's required. Just to go to the next.
Correct. That is
the death of the other, the sister
of Reuven
just happens.
It
the
happens.
Same way he becomes. It's
correct, but then if we take Jeff your logic, then in the case of a katan,
right.
We should compare it to the case of Achos Ishto, where she died,
Right.
which we don't.
Right.
So again, I think what he's saying is the issue here, is there a zika for Yibum?
Yeah.
In the case of Achos Ishto, there is no zika for Yibum, because at the moment that Shimon died, she is Achos Ishto. And then we apply the principle of Kol Shani Einani Kori Ba B'Shas Nefil Yibum, etc. But in the case of a katan, saying that essentially there isn't a Nefil Yibum. There's a technical problem. Right now, he's not capable of Lahakim Shem Li'achiv. Let's just wait it out. And basically, in the case of Nida as well, there is a Nefil Yibum. Just we have to wait it out. Again, she'll have to jump into the mikveh as well. I'm not denying that. But fundamentally, and I'll prove it to you because it's a kind of situation that exists between a husband and a wife, that they cannot, have an intimate relationship till she goes to them. Okay. Now at this point, I have a few things on the agenda, and I'm not sure. Let me just make a quick decision in my mind what the sequence should be. There's just a whole bunch of things that we have to talk about. Let me talk this out. First of all, there's a tosis here. Ocean Nimseis Islands. Right, do you see that tosis? It's the first tosis on Beis Amid Beis. Ocean Nimseis Islands. You know what? I'm inclined to maybe wait a little bit with that Tosfos. And I'm going to give Zchut Kedima here to the law of Tzoras Ereva. And now what we want to study is an insight of Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. Okay, so it's a paragraph that starts Potros es Sorosein. You have it on the right side. Let me just say by way of introduction, what we're about to embark upon is a chakira which really belongs to the methodology of what we call lumdus, meaning we're about to embark upon what I call a classic chakira. I used to give a weekly class here in this very classroom called the Brisket Derech Halimut. It was a methodology class of how to understand lumdus. This, which I didn't know about, would be a perfect example. The classic example of this kind of methodology that we're about to embark upon is what's called mishmush nachala. Have you ever heard of that phrase? It works like this. Let's say Yaakov has a son named Reuven, and Reuven has a son named Chanoch. So Chanoch is the grandson of Yaakov. Now, normally, what would happen is if nature, held up for us without being cruel, is that Yaakov would die, and Reuven, his son, would inherit his father. And then when Reuven dies, Chanoch ben Reuven will inherit his father Reuven. But what happened is, fortunately, tragically, Reuven died during the lifetime of Yaakov. And now, in such a case, what's going to happen is that Chanoch now becomes first in line to inherit his grandfather. Now, he's not going to inherit his grandfather through his father Reuven, because Reuven died during the lifetime of Yaakov, of the grandfather. Are you with me? So now there's a halacha called mishmush nachala, which, like if I would say it in a literary, literally, it means that Reuven inherits his father Yaakov even bekever, even when he's buried on the ground. And then, since Reuven is gone, therefore, Chanoch ben Reuven will inherit the possessions of Yaakov. So again, the famous lumdus, maybe you can already guess what I'm about to say. How does this operate? Do we say that Chanoch, the grandson, has no direct relationship with his grandfather, but rather his relationship is only to his father Reuven? But Reuven somehow magically inherits his father even though Reuven is gone? Or do we say no, that Reuven links up his son Chanoch to his father Yaakov, and now there's a direct relationship between the grandfather and the grandson? And there's another sugya which is also very similar to this, called Shibuda de Rav Nosson, in which Levi owes money to Reuven, and Reuven owes money to Yaakov, and the question is whether Yaakov could collect directly from Levi. So Rav Elchanan wants to apply this kind of methodology to the case of Tsaras Erva. We know from our Mishnah, and the Gemara derives this from a Yalfusa Litzrar, that if both Leah and Rivka are married to Shimon, Leah is an erva to Reuven, Shimon's brother. Rivka is not related in any other way to Reuven other than the fact that she's married to his brother. So not only doesn't Leah fall for Yibum, but even Rivka won't fall for Yibum because she's a Tzara. How does this work? Is there a new category called Tsaras Erva? Well, no. What happens is there's only one category as far as Yibum is concerned, to undermine Yibum, and that is Erva. But the Torah says that since she's a Tzara to the Erva, she sort of, through the Erva, gets linked up as an Erva, as a quasi-Erva to Reuven, to the The other way of saying it is that no, there's a new erva which is called Tsaras erva. So let's see it inside. Ha'im v'kara p'tur u'ba'erva atzma. In other words, the p'tur is inherent in the erva, not in the Tsaras erva. Ela shehi, but she, we'll call a Leah in this case, mamshicha also, she stretches or extends af al tzarasa, that p'tur. So the p'tur is chal on Leah, and Leah shares that p'tur with Rivka. That's the first time. Lomar, Moshe Shem, oh, he applies to Bito. We used it in the case of Achos Ishto, doesn't matter. Poter miyibu. Tachgam Soras Bito. I'm sorry, I skipped. So that's number one. O. Okay, so we have to underline the word O. Sheptur Hatsara, hu ptur bifnei atzma. In other words, the status of the tzara is inherent in the tzara herself, independent of the erva. And there's a shame soras bito, just like there's a shame, a category in law called bito. There's another category called soras bito, and soras bito is also a category which exempts and removes evil. It's Rabbi Chanan. I'm going to prove to you that it's like the second definition. Now, in order to appreciate Rabbi Chanan's proof, we have to look a little bit at a sugya on Daf Yud Gimel. The Gemara has two opinions on Daf Yud Gimel. One of the opinions says that Misa Mapelos, which means that the whole issue of whether or not a woman falls for Yibum is totally exclusively dependent upon the situation that exists at the time that her husband dies. The other opinion says Nisuin Mapilin. What is Nisuin Mapilin? The situation of Yibum depends upon the moment that this woman married Shimon, the Yavam. Why? Because inherent in the marriage between, let's call it Shimon and Leah, is Yibum, meaning that in an event that Shimon said, I mean, he doesn't say this, but he basically says, Hareat Makudeshesli, but in event that I die without children, you are going to fall for Yibum to my brother Reuben. And that's called Nisuin Mapilu. Now watch what happens in the following scenario. Leah gets married to Shimon, and she's an erva to Reuven. Now, in addition to Shimon getting married to Leah, who's an erva to Reuven, Shimon got married to Rivka. Now, Shimon divorces his wife Leah. What would you say? I mean, just a knee-jerk response. Would Rivka fall for Yibum to Reuven?
Yes.
Yes, for sure, right? Because the only reason why Rivka is out of the picture of Yibum is because she's a tzara to Leah, who's the sister of Reuven's wife Rachel. Leah's out of the picture now because Shimon divorced Leah. So let's imagine, just to dramatize it. Shimon marries Leah, marries Rivka, and the next day, right, 2 days after he married Leah, he divorces Leah. So the Gemara says that in such a case, again, there are two paragraphs. In such a case, Leah, well, no, actually, I can skip that paragraph because Leah's divorced, so that there's certainly no Yibum to Leah. Oh, so the Gemara says that if you hold that Nisuin Mapilin, then Rivka will not fall for Yibum to Reuven when Shimon dies because she is a tzaras erva. Why? Because Leah, the first wife, so to speak, of Shimon, was an erva to Reuven. Wait a second. But Shimon divorced Leah, and now he dies, and Rivka falls for Yibum to Reuven. She's not a tzaras erva. What do you mean a tzaras erva? The erva is history. She was divorced by her husband Shimon. But we're holding now Nisuin Mapilin. So that we go back to the moment of marriage, and at the moment that Shimon married Leah, he already, so to speak, built into that marriage a Yibum relationship. But Leah is Achos Ishto. So therefore she has the din of a tsaras, of an erva, right? Leah, I'm talking about Leah. Okay, just 1 second. Iskarsha erva o mesa b'chaye baila arasa ptura michalitza v'yibum. Wait a second. At the moment that Shimon died, Rivka is not at Tsaras erva. And yet the Gemara says that if you hold Nesuin Mapilin, there's no Yibum. Rivka will not fall for Yibum to Reuven because she's at Tsaras erva. How could she be at Tsaras erva if by the time Shimon died, Leah was completely out of the picture? Says Rabbi Chanan, Behechre, if I was asking, you cannot call Rivka a Tsaras erva because the erva is not in the picture anymore. The erva was divorced. So at the moment that Shimon died, there was no erva in the picture. So why is Rivka, the other wife of Shimon, a Tsaras erva? He says, Elamuchach shechal bitsara shem ptur mechudosh shel Tsaras erva. That she Rivka is called a Tsaras erva. Why? Because before the divorce of Leah, Rivka was a Tsaras erva. Now at the time of the beast of Shimon, she's not a Tsaras erva. The erva is out of the picture. It doesn't matter because Tsaras erva, says Rabbi Chanan, is ke'erva atzma in Yibum. It now becomes inherent in the Tsaras erva. There's a new category called Tsaras erva. She's a Tsara of Achos Ishta. There's only one thing that bothers me here. Isn't there a mistake here? I understand what he's saying. It's a brilliant but the holding now that is suin mapil. And if the suin mapil, I think I have to add one point here, but I'll see if it fits into the text. It must be that Shimon divorced Leah after he was married to Rivka. Because, right?
Yes.
Is that correct? Yeah. Let me just read it inside. You have to add another point. It's b'chai baila, but it's li'achar hanesuin litzaras Rivka. Otherwise, they're not tzaras. Right. It's tzaras aptura. So I'm surprised he didn't. Maybe it was so simple to me, he didn't bother even mentioning. So again, let's just go over the logic. The very moment, I'm still confused. Very moment that what? That he married Rivka, she was at Tsaras erva. Why? Because he hasn't yet divorced his wife, Leah. Because it's Tsaras erva. Yeah, I see what he's saying. What do you mean she's a Tsaras erva? She's a Tsaras erva as far as Yibum is concerned, but if subsequent to her marriage to Shimon divorced Leah, then she's not a Tsaras erva anymore. But the answer is she became a Tsaras erva at the moment of Nisuin. But again, that's got to be inherent in her status as a Tzaras Erva, because you can't say that she's a Tzaras Erva because she, the Erva is passing on the baton to her. And it's an extension of the status of the Erva, because the Erva is completely out of the picture. I think I have it. I'm not 100% sure. I have to go over it a few more times. Okay. Next. Okay. So the truth is that I wanted to get to Rabbi Kivega, but I'm going to give first preference here to Rabbi Shmuel because it's printed earlier on the page. And that's the very next paragraph, Tzoros Seder. Okay. Now the Gemara on Daf Gimel Amid Beis is going to derive the category of Tzoras Sara from a pasuk, and specifically from the extra resh in the pasuk of Litzra. It could have said Latzur, which would only have one resh, but Litzra has two reshes, and the extra resh is coming to patter up a Tzoras Sara. Okay. Now we have a kasha from Chidushay Rabbi Shmuel, who is the Rashiva Panovich, Rabbi Shmuel Rozovsky. The Gemara Daf Yud Gimel and Aleph records a machlokas hamoraim between Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi argues that Sarah doesn't need a pasuk at all. We can derive it from Svara. So that which it says on Daf Gimel and Beis, that Sarah is derived from the extra letter Reish, that reflects the Shita of Rav Ashi's Bar Plukta, namely Rav Yehuda, the Amora Rav Yehuda. Rav Ashi himself thinks that we can derive Sarah from Svar. And now we're going to analyze Tosfos's analysis of Rav Ashi's Svar. Kishem shet Sarah asura, kain Sarah asura. Okay. So why is it that Rav Ashi insists that we don't need a pasuk for Tzoras Sara? We can derive Tzoras Sara from Svar. Now, Tosfos says that Sarah, according to Rav Ashi, is derived from Svara, but even Rav Ashi would agree that if you go one generation beyond that, in other words, what's called Ad Sofa Olam, that requires no, let me say it this way. According to Tosfos, in one interpretation, Rav Ashi would also agree that you need the pasuk litzor to derive the Isur of Tsaras Tzara. The only machlokes between Rav Ashi and Rav Yehuda is in Ad Sofa Olam, in the next generation. But the breakthrough of Tsaras Tzara requires a drasha litzor, according to everyone, even according to Rav Ashi. So Shmuel says, I don't understand the logic, because we already know the law of tzara, of tzaras erva. Well, what happens in the case of tzaras erva is that there's no yibum. If there's no yibum, then she becomes Eishes Ach Shelo b'makom mitzvah. An Eishes Ach Shelo b'makom mitzvah is an Eishes Ach. You follow? Right? A man can only marry his sister, or meaning his late brother's wife, because of the mitzvah yibum. If there's no mitzvah yibum, then we're back to square one, and she is Eishes Ach. Now the Torah tells me that even the tzara of this erva doesn't fall for yibum. Well, if she doesn't fall for yibum, then again she's an Eishes Ach. And therefore, Tsaras Tzara will not fall for yibum because she is exactly identical to Tsaras Erva. There's no difference between Tsaras Erva and Tsaras Erva. Why? Because Tsaras Erva now becomes an Erva of Eishes Ach. Again, which way it works, whether it's Rebbe Chanan this way, Rebbe Chanan that way, it's irrelevant. But at the end of the day, a Tsaras Erva is an Eishes Ach because it's Shalom b'makom mitzvah. The Mela, if there's a Tsaras Tzara, then she's a Tsaras Erva. Okay, what's a Tsaras Tzara? So a Tsaras Tzara means the following, that the Tsaras Erva now gets married to Shimon, and Shimon is married to another woman. That other woman, likewise, is excluded from Yibum and is Asura because she's the tzara of a tzaras erva. So let's say, for example, we had the case of Leah and Rivka, right? Leah is an erva to Reuven. Rivka is a tzaras erva to Reuven. If at some point Rivka gets married to Yitzchak, then Yitzchak, not only is Rivka excluded from Yibum, which we already did that, but now Sprenzel is excluded from Yibum because she's a tzara of a tzaras erva. And Tosfos says that, that in the case, and what do we just say? That in the case of tzaras tzara, we certainly don't need a apostle. Just 1 second. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Ashi, again, it comes out that what? As far as Tzaras, as far as Tzaras is concerned, Tosfos says that even Rav Ashi agrees that you need a pasuk litzra. Why is that so? Tzaras Tzara is basically Tzaras Erva. There's no hair's breadth of a difference between Tzaras Erva and Tzaras Tzara, because Tzaras Tzara is a Tzaras Erva. Why? Because Tzaras Erva is an Erva. And why is Tzaras Erva an Erva? Because once the pasuk teaches me mitzvah that the Tzaras Erva doesn't fall for Yibum, that's Rivka, who is co-married to Shimon together with Leah, and Leah's an Erva, then Rivka herself becomes an Erva of Eishes Ach. So that the tzara of Rivka in the next marriage is a tzara of an erva. Look at it inside. He says, "Kasav b'chidusha Rabbi Shmuel shemidivrei Rashi lahalon mashma shetzara poteres es tzaras mishum shemei achar sheniftara miyibum harei nases ke'eshes ach shelo b'makom mitzvah v'im shem zeh shel ervas eshes ach hi poteres es tzaras." So that a tzaras erva is an erva because she's an Eishes Ach. And now this tsaras erva would patter up the tsaras tsara because the tsaras tsara is a tsaras erva. So how can Tosas possibly say that everybody agrees, even Rav Ashi, that we need a pasuk for tsaras erva? I'm sorry, that we need a pasuk. Even Rav Ashi agrees we need a pasuk for tsaras tsara. Why do you need a pasuk for tsaras tsara? Once you've derived the principle that Tsaras Erva is not in Yibum, then Tsaras Tzara is likewise not in Yibum because she's in Tsaras Erva. What do you say, Steve? You have to speak and drop loud.
Right. No. I mean, it logically doesn't make a lot of sense to me because couldn't Ruvain marry Rivka's sister?
Yeah, for sure. Ruvain's not related to Rivka.
Right. So why can't he marry Rivka's co-wife?
Because Rivka's co-wife is a Tsaras Erva because Rivka is an Erva. Now, why is Rivka an Erva? Rivka is an Erva because she's a co-wife of Leah, and Leah is the sister of Ruvain's wife, Rachel. Once Leah is an Erva, she doesn't fall for Yibum. She now is an Eishes Ach. Her Tzara, namely Rivka, is now a Tsaras Erva. And if Rivka is a Tsaras Erva, she now also is an Eishes Ach. Whenever there's no mitzvah of Yibum, we go back to square one, and the erev of Eishes Ach is activated.
Yeah, but I mean, is Yitzchak's wife she's anywhere closely related to me.
Well, again, Yitzchak married Rivka, correct?
Right.
Who is a Tsaras Erev. He's also married to Shpritza. She's a Tsaras Erev. But her status is no different than that of Rivka herself. Why? Because since Rivka can't fall for Yibum to Ruvain, because Rivka is a Tsaras Erva, is right because she was married together with Leah, with Rachel. Well, I'm sorry, with Leah. Is Memela, Rivka becomes an Erva, namely Eishes Ach. Well, again, I don't want to get into that machlokas. Whenever it is, But I'm just saying that if basically, we're saying the following: that if a certain woman can't fall for Yibum, then her tzara can't fall for Yibum because her tzara is always going to be a tzaras erva, and it really doesn't matter how many generations you go down. It's always going to be the same thing. That whenever the Torah knocks off Yibum, the Torah says that a tzaras erva doesn't fall for Yibum, then the tzaras erva now becomes an erva because she's a shizah. Again, how does she become an Erev of Eishes? That's Rabbi Chanan's chakir. But it doesn't matter because either way, this question that we're raising now is irrelevant to Rabbi Chanan. Because at the end of the day, whether it works in this way, because we extend, the status of the Erva and it includes the Tzaras Erva, or the Tzaras Erva herself is an Erva, when it comes to Eishes Ach, there's always going to be an erev of Eishes Ach with regard to the Tzaras Erva. Why? Because if the Torah says that there's no Yibum to the Tzaras Erva, she Mamela becomes Eishes Ach. And if she's Eishes Ach, then any woman, as we said, that's co-married to anybody is a Tzaras Erva. Now, how can you tell me that even Rav Ashi agrees that we need a pasuk for Tzaras Tzara? And the only machlokas between Rav Ashi and Rav Yehuda is about Ad Sofa Olam. That's Reb Shmuel. Achochiach me'apirish hasheni shebetosus hanal loke sharei l'darkam af soras hatzora nifteres rak mikoach drosha. Right? Tosfos says that. Second. That Soras. What does he mean? The terrace Mikol Josh. That's according to Rabbi Yehuda. We just said according to Rabbi Ashi. Soras ever doesn't. Right. The Pirusha Masheni, Afra Rabbi Ashi, and Soras Sora mean Litzra. That's what we asked the Kasha. Why does Sarah need a pasuk litzvah? So it must be that Tosfos is working with a different set of logical principles here, because when it comes to Sarah, Tosfos agrees that you need a pasuk, which makes no sense. The efshal of potra mikoach haptur shenema b'tzaras tzara, that somehow tzaras tzara doesn't have the same ptur as tzaras tzara. Why not? The im is chadesh b'tzaras tzara sheshem eshes ach poter es hatzara miyibu. Shita shaf tzaras tzara poteres es tzarasa. Sharei me'achar sheniftar miyibu gam hi ervas eshes ach hitzara rishona. Okay, so that's the kasha of Shmuel, but I'm looking for the answer. Mishum ervas eshes ach, ela mishum soras achos isha. Okay, misfora ein lechadish af soras achos isha. Yeah, but he doesn't explain why this is so. He's saying that the ptur of Sarah, even after we derive it from the pasuk with Sarah, is not a ptur of ervas eshes ach, because otherwise it would always be passed on from one to the next Sarah to the next Sarah, and there would be no need, as Tosfos claims there is, to derive tzaras erva from a pasuk. Okay, now Rabbosai, I'm going to skip the next paragraph for the time being. I want to talk to you about Rabbi Kiveig. And I have to tell you that I learned Yevamot when I was 18 years old in Kerem B'Yavne. And the only thing I remember was, well, maybe the few other things, but Rabbi Kiveig. I don't remember what Rabbi Kiveig asked or what he answered, but that I remember. And this is the Rabbi Kiveig that I remember from Kerem B'Yavne Tovshin Lam. Rabbi Kiveig, mat tzarech b'litzor, kidei liftar tzaras tzara miyibum. Halo me'acha sheniftar tzara rishon miyibum shuv chazalon iser eshes ach v'naseis erva gebur mitzad atzm became tiftar tzarasa idin called tzaras erva. Again, we're coming back to the same kasha over and over again, and that's eshes ach, right? The erva of eshes ach is always the skeleton in the closet. It's always suspended. And it's being prevented from coming to the fore. But as soon as you exclude Zikas Yibum, then the Erev of eshes ach again comes back to haunt us. So why does the Gemara insist that in the case of Tzaras Erva, we need a pasuk of Litzra? Once the first Tzara is parted from Yibum, then hard Tzara, which is called Tzaras Tzara, is a Tzaras Erva. Sharei lo gora shem ervas eshes ach shelo b'makom mitzvah mishar arayis hapotros es tzorosei. So I'll tell you the truth. If I would stop here and just ask for some sort of a shoot from the hip kind of an answer, I would invoke the principle called hutar mechlol. I don't know if anyone's going to say this, and it's probably not correct, but are you familiar with Hutar B'Chlolo? You could have two Isurim, both have the same name, but one is more lenient than the other because one lends itself in one particular scenario to a leniency. That's called Hutar B'Chlolo. It's sort of like if you imagine a balloon and then you puncture a hole in the balloon. Once there's a hole in the balloon, it's not the same balloon, even if you could patch it up or whatever. So I'll give you the classic example of Huta Mechlolo is Chadash between the Omer and the Shtei Lechem, like now, today. Let's say a person would bring a mincha min Chadash from this year's Teruah today on the 30, what are we up to? I lost the count, 32nd? On the 22nd. On the 22nd day of the Omer, right? I'm anxious for Lag BaOmer. So the Mishnah says in such a case the mincha is kshera. He shouldn't have done it because the Torah says that the first mincha has to be the Shtei Lechem, which is coming on Shavuos, but nevertheless it's kshera. But if he brought that same mincha min Chadash before the Omer, that means before the 16th of Nisan, then the mincha is psul. The Gemara says, what's the difference? I mean, in both cases, it's Chadash. You have to wait till the Shtei Lechem is brought on Shavuos. So the Gemara says that if it was after the Omer, it's Hutar Mechlol. That the general Isser of Chadash now has a hole in it. Why? Because at least as far as Achilas Adam is concerned, everything now is Yasha. All right. I always remind myself, I got stuck in Skokie Yeshiva for almost a week because of a snowstorm. And I was makbid on Chadash, but I lucked out because of Rav Salvation in Skokie, all the food was Yasha. So I was able to eat for that week. I remember Jerry Eisenberg took good care of me. Anyway. By the way, the snowstorm was not in Chicago, it was in New York. There were no flights going to New York from Chicago because of the snowstorm on the East Coast. That's very rare. You usually get stuck in Chicago, it's because it never stops snowing in Chicago. But I got the exact opposite. So I would suggest that maybe Eishes Ach becomes Huta Mechlol. Why? Because in a case of Yibum, that very erva, the Torah removes the erva and permits a brother-in-law to marry a sister-in-law. And herein lies the difference between Tsaras erva and Tsaras erva. Why? Because in the case of Tsaras erva, she is now connected to the erva herself, right? So that when Shimon dies, he leaves two wives. He's got Leah and he's got Rivka. So Rivka is it Tsaras erva? So that I understand. The Torah says Tsaras erva doesn't fall for Yibum. But now, when we get to the next round, where Rivka is now a co-wife to Spritzel, so that's already a whole different story. Rabbi Kivega is saying, what do you mean? Since Rivka didn't fall for Yibum, she's an Eishes Ach. Yeah, but she was an Eishes Ach that had a Huta Mechlolo, because if not for the fact that she was a Tzara to Leah, who's Reuven's sister-in-law, through his wife, then she, in and of herself, would have fell for you. So her Isser of Eishes Ach lends itself to a Mati, so it's not a full-fledged Isser error. Okay, I don't know if there's any. He says, we're not going to get to the answer to this question today, but I want to just set up the framework. He says, Hochiach came midivrei HaTosfos shekosvu sheyivama shenesra al Yevamot. I think the second Yevamah here has a mapikei to it. So Yevam is the woman and Yevamah is her Yavam. Right? Yavam Shalah. The Iser Eishes Ish. You go and Shemishas Nefila, Hoisach Hos Isha, Bemelo Hutar Iser Eishes Ish, Eishes Ach Shalah. Al Ken, Af Bistalik Mimeno Iser Hos Isha, Rehi Asura Lomis Bi Iser Eishes Ach. The Af Tzarasa Ptura Mishum Tzaras Eishes Ach, Nimsa Ki Tzaras Ach. Eino Tzara Shnia Bilvad, Ele Bichlal Tzaras every Shonen, meaning she's an Eishes Ach. Shari he gam kein Tzaras Eishes Ach. Beloma Tzricha Yidrosha Nefredes Kidei Lefotra. Kama Pirutzim Nemru Bazeh Kimefurat Bisamu. take a look how many different answers he has. If I'm not mistaken, he's got 7 different answers to Rabbi Akiva Eiger's question. I mean, you have up to 6. Of course, I didn't give you the next page, but on the next page he has number 7. It's like a who's list in the Achronim. The first answer is going to be the Netziv Mibaloshin, the Rome Sada. Second is Reb Shimon Shkop. Third is another answer, Reb Shimon Shkop. Fourth is Reb Elchanan. Fifth is the Chazon Ish. Sixth is the Birchas Shmuel, Reb Baruch Ber. And the 7th is the Aviyah Ezri, Rav Shach. It's almost like every Rosh Yeshiva who's worth his salt decided to tackle Rabbi Akiva Eiger's kasha and try to come up with an answer to his question. So, B'li Neder, I'm going to try to prepare this for tomorrow. And then, let me just also mention that on the agenda is Tosfos on the top of Beis Amid Beis, Dibra Maskel Ocean Nimtzu Islands. We didn't do that yet. Now, Tosfos Bito on Daf Beis Amid Aleph, we did, I think, half of the Tosfos. So we'll see if we need the other half of the Tosfos. I took a superficial look at Tosfos Dibra Maskel Eishes Achiv Me'imo, and I decided that that's not for us. It's just, whoa. This is, these are sugyas later on in Masechet Yevamot that are quite complicated. We're not ready for that. So that's what we have now. I need something to put here. Is there a piece of paper floating around? All right. Put that one. Okay then, so everyone should have a great day.